when the Gospel of Mark opens with quotations from the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
The gospel writer isn't just thinking, okay, I want them to read this section. The gospel writer is thinking, where this section comes from says something important about what's happening right now in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's wanting you not to just read those words on the page, but wanting you to know what the words on the page here said on the page they originally came
look out
from.
for my worldview. Cloudy when you sinking, got you thinking it's a whirlpool. Caesar in your pockets, you can't see who's in your pockets, but Stevie's inner visions touch your eyes and make the world move. Wifey bob her head and make her curls move. Crown jewel is character, and this ain't immortality with fairy dust.
Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Byler, dedicated to those deconstructing, reconstructing their faith. I'm actually thinking of changing that tagline, by the way. But maybe that's another conversation. We are back again after a long time of being off. We were off for a break, so we didn't do much during that time. I spent a lot of it traveling for family and some other things that happened over Christmas. And I was just like hammering everything out at the end of the semester before that. So some of you might be happy or sad to see my sorry face back on the internet, but here we are. And Daniel is with me. We have an interesting discussion, hopefully, as they all have been today, kind of planned out something regarding what Daniel wrote about last semester and something that's been weaved through conversations that haven't been recorded since then. So Daniel, if you want to tell everybody kind of maybe what you've been up to and what we're going to talk about.
So life as a seminary student, semester hit, and you and I were like, okay, let's do class and not this for a while. And I mean, I guess we kind of made several attempts at it, but it never really panned out, and break was crazy. So last semester I took a class on History of Christianity 1. So it's a class sequence. And in that class, I wrote a paper using some of Augustine's thoughts on biblical interpretation. And you and I have had a decent bit of conversations about that topic, not recorded, just kind of casually. And those led to some very interesting conversations and something we thought would be pretty good to record. So the basic premise, I guess, if you want me to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that biblical interpretation is best framed as artistic in nature.
What do you mean, Daniel? Isn't a plain reading the best reading?
So do you want me to just go ahead and start reading the quote? That might best address your question. So an excerpt from my paper. At this point, it becomes essential to view interpretation of the biblical
hang on, sorry, before you do this quotation here, kind of give people a snapshot of the subject of the paper, and then why Augustine is an important person to pinpoint in this frame.
So Augustine is important because, well, one, he's St. Augustine. I mean, if you haven't heard of him, you don't know much about church history, for sure. He has done a lot of biblical interpretation himself, and has been very influential in Western Christian thought for, basically since his day. His general perspective on biblical interpretation is, he views very strongly this idea that there's one objective truth that exists, at least when it comes to mutually exclusive claims.
Mm-hmm.
But he recognizes that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for fallible humans to recognize what that objective truth is purely and isolated. And so through this, in his Confessions, which is one of his more well-known works, he talks about different interpretations of Genesis 1. He calls them literal interpretations, which is interesting because almost none of the literal interpretations that he lists in a very long list match up with what modern, specifically American Christians would call the literal interpretation of Genesis 1, which is kind of funny. And can make some people uncomfortable. But I will remind you, this is St. Augustine of Hippo, who is responsible for most of the way Western Christian thought has progressed since his time, 1500-ish years ago. So his thought processes are very well ingrained in Christianity. And not that I think he's always correct. I don't.
Yeah, we had a whole episode where I disagreed with his conceptions
Yeah.
of original sin. So
Yeah.
if you want an episode where I agree with Augustine, here we are.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that just shows the complexity and nuance of thought and truth and seeking after God. And as we will see, I don't think that Augustine is afraid of people disagreeing with him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think there comes a point in which he says, if you disagree too starkly, you're no longer Christian. But that's a boundary that's up for debate, and one that needs to be talked about. And that's kind of a broader topic that's probably not one for our conversation today. But yeah, so I wrote this paper kind of exploring the way in which Augustine himself conceptualizes biblical interpretation. And I make the point in this paper that biblical interpretation is best done in an artistic manner. So I guess I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that, and then I'll let you read that snippet.
Yeah.
So and you want me to just go ahead and use the analogy?
Well, you're going to read it here in a minute. So
Okay, yeah.
why don't we do this? I will read this snippet just so you know that we're not like, this is again like what I was also trying to do in our conversation about inspiration and inerrancy. Is like, this isn't us just like riffing on one thing because we're trying to be cool or like different. Kind of like prove the point that this is much a debate in all of scholarship about approaches to hermeneutics, essentially.
Well, all of scholarship in Christian life. I mean, Augustine goes way back.
Oh yeah, is that in my hermeneutics class last semester we had this book, Elements of Biblical Exegesis by Michael Gorman, and he has a little section in the first chapter on different ways to exegete, different ways to get meaning, let's say, out of the text. And he has just this really short 2-paragraph section on exegesis as art. And he says this, to quote, "The word method, however, should not be equated precisely with scientific method or historical method. Good reading, like good conversation or any sort of good investigation, is an art more than it is a science. Exegesis, as we will see throughout this book, is therefore an art. To be sure, there are certain principles and elements to consider. We'll get to that here in a minute to continue the quotation. But knowing what to ask of a text, what to think about a text, what to say about a text, can never be accomplished with complete certainty or done with method alone. Rather, an exegete needs not only principles, rules, hard work, and research skills, but also intuition, imagination, sensitivity, and a bit of serendipity on occasion. The task of exegesis requires, therefore, enormous intellectual and even spiritual energy. In fact, as Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholar William Brown puts it, good exegesis is, to quote him, a practice of empathy, wonder, and hospitality. The result, he rightly claims, can be both transformative and joyful. Many people experience this art, therefore, as rewarding spiritual discipline. This has certainly been true for most of the great biblical interpreters in both Judaism and Christianity. As the Anglican Book of Common Prayer tells us, Scripture is something to hear, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. And I think what's important is that last paragraph of that first section. To be sure, there are certain principles and elements to consider, but knowing what to ask of a text, what to think about a text, what to say about a text, can never be accomplished with complete certainty or done with method alone. Rather, an exegete needs not only principles, rules, and hard work, but intuition, imagination, sensitivity, and even a bit of serendipity.
What's super funny is that I hadn't read that passage, and I ended up using some of the exact same words in my essay.
Well, there we go.
Yeah,
that's from my textbook last semester on hermeneutics, biblical interpretation.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome.
This is very much in line with what you wrote about Augustine's approach.
Yeah.
How to have some of those elements of not just pure scientific or historical method in your frame to interpret what's going on in the Bible. So if you want to read a little bit of your take from that essay, go ahead.
Yeah. So I spent some time introducing the topic and specifically talking about different interpretations that Augustine that are popular in Augustine's time, or that Augustine holds for Genesis 1 specifically. I mean, that kind of serves as the backdrop for his conversation about this topic. So I say, at this point, it becomes essential to view the interpretation of the biblical corpus as artistic in nature. Augustine does not allow for the indecisive framework of postmodern interpretive lenses, as many Christians today also protest. Augustine deeply desires structure and believes in one objective truth. Excuse me, that's something that I said earlier. But as we will see, he does not think that we can certainly know what the truth is in any given situation. This means interpreting the Bible is best done by capturing the meaning subjectively expressed in words with multiple possible meanings and translations. We should progress through the biblical text in an exploratory and expressive fashion, looking for meaning buried within, not just objectively stated on the surface of a passage. Through biblical...
There's your refute of plain reading.
Yeah, exactly. A plain reading, well, I mean, this sort of calls into question what it means to plainly read, right? I'll read this this middle section again. Interpreting the Bible is best done by capturing the meaning subjectively expressed in words with multiple possible meanings and translations. A plain reading can mean multiple things simultaneously. That's why Augustine's literal interpretation and our literal interpretation and his contemporaries' literal interpretation are very different sometimes. It's because one word can mean multiple things. And when you string multiple words together, all of those words together can mean a multiplicity of multiple things. And so it becomes incredibly difficult to say this is objectively what the text says. So I'll continue. Through biblical interpretation, though biblical interpretation is artistic in this way, many artists express that their art production is most fruitful and beautiful when done within constraints. Music, for example, has at least the constraints of tempo, key, and a balance of harmony and melody, among other things. We rarely consider it artful when someone sings off key, when harmonies don't align, or when the tempo of two musicians are off by even half a beat. When these confining structures, within these confining structures, a plethora of ranges is given to be artistic, expressive, and exploratory, but the framework must stay in place, and they were created for a reason. Thus, and similarly, biblical interpretation is artistic.
So explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So music is an art form, right? No one would say, and there are some, you could say, scientific things about music, but generally speaking, if I said, is music art or science? Anyone on the street would say it's art, right? And the reason we say that is because it's very expressive and exploratory and creative, imaginative, right? I think similarly, and as your quote from your hermeneutics book talked about, biblical interpretation involves a little intuition, a little serendipity, a little imaginative expression, because you're taking these sometimes objective and sometimes subjective words and you're stringing them together in a way that's supposed to make meaning. So just like, I mean, with that said, it's our goal as biblical interpreters to provide as much structure as we can to keep ourselves in check. So just like music has tempo and key and harmony and melody and all these other things that go into it, I think it's important for us as biblical interpreters to also set safeguards and structures around ourselves that can help us keep ourselves and others in check, but also help steer us in the right directions. And I have some ideas about what these are, but I think you had a further analogy about just the artistic nature of Scripture.
Yeah, we can go there specifically now if you want to, or if you want to jump to some modern examples so people kind of wrap their heads around what we're trying to say.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, I think let's go there first to kind of give
Absolutely
like a parallel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about even more than the example we've already kind of talked about in a previous conversation is there's part of this frame of biblical interpretation as art that to engage in it, it has an assumption that the Bible is doing art, which to some that might sound self-evident, but to others, I don't think we think about it very much, which is why I made the video about reading the Bible as fiction, which is like talking about how the art is doing like literary narrative things, right? Because there's confining, and we talked about this in my New Testament class a couple of days ago, even within different structures, be it films or literary genres, there are constraints. Even different music genres, there's certain constraints, or there's certain expectations, let's say. Right? Like EDM plays by different rules than pop music.
Yeah.
Like even though they might be heavily electronic at this point in both respects, right? There's different rules to how each of those genres work that are in some sense like, I'll use the phrase like self-censoring, right? And this is what gets really interesting about like the mashup and like the subgenres. So like, I don't know, one of my favorite bands, Dance Gavin Dance, for instance, some of you might be familiar. They're like post-hardcore, or like math hardcore in terms of like guitarists. But then like you have oh gosh, what's his name? Tillian, who does like the pop style vocal, and then John Mass, who does the scream vocal. And so like, but they're still playing by certain rules, even in those genres, right? The instrumentation is like hardcore, like post-hardcore rock. And like the drums are on beat and they go with like, and even the vocals, like there's a switches or overlays, but they like have to work in harmony with each other. So even in the mashups, even in the like genre bending that happens a lot these days with the music, you still have to abide by rules, even of the genres you're mashing.
Well, and here's the thing too, right? Is music is art, but even within defining genres, you've already defined a structure, right? a framework in which you operate. And I mean, Peterson talks about this, I think, a little bit, is that, I mean, we need structures, we need frameworks in order to be able to operate well as human beings. And so I think it's just interesting because within at least the artistic mode, it's the structure and the expectation that that structure brings that then sometimes even allows you as the artist to subvert that expectation and do something that's unexpected. And the Bible does that all the time, which is I mean, one of the most artistic things you can do.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking of, oh gosh, you know, one of your filmmakers, Quentin Tarantino, right? When Pulp Fiction was really, I mean, yes, Reservoir Dogs was, you know, fairly big, at least in the like film circuits it went in the late 90s when it came out. But Pulp Fiction is what put them on the map. And that's what made non-linear storytelling kind of thing. Like, I think you could make a thesis that like without Tarantino, you'd have no Nolan, but maybe that's a different conversation. But he still plays within, and Tarantino self-admits this all the time. He's like, yeah, but I'm playing in genre and subgenre. So like, even though I might be subverting certain expectations about events that happen, be them historical and not historical, thinking of like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Like he is doing kind of a genre that he's made popular, revisionist history, and Inglourious Basterds, and in Once Upon a Time, and even in like Django. It seems to always come up in my film conversations, but like he's doing a, like I've talked about this before on the podcast, but he's like doing a inversion of the Western genre, but still using Western tropes who make it clear what genre he's in. And he's like doing some kind of a revisionist history story in the conflicts and in the characters of that movie. Right. And even in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, spoiler alert, but I mean, I think most people have seen it by now who want to see it. He's playing with your expectation of like what you know happened to Sharon Tate. So then when the scene happens where they end up going to the wrong house and Brad Pitt just beats the like living crap out of everybody, you're like, yes, right? But that's what he wants. Same thing with Inglourious Basterds. Like when you see Hitler get killed, you're like, oh yeah. And even Django, like you're like, oh yeah, sweet revenge, right? So he's even playing in the like revenge subgenre in his historical like revisionist history genre. In like the war movie genre, be it Inglourious Basterds, or like the Western genre, be it Django Unchained. And even at that, he's playing with like Django. The film came before that, right? So like, and again, this can get to like the other example we have, but just to point out that like even in the people who like break the mold, quote unquote, of like what's happening, there's so much going on underneath that that plays with our expectations and how things operate. And I think when things break that too much, it's like incomprehensible and
it becomes jarring.
Doesn't appeal. So the example we've been talking about in terms of sort of how what I alluded to in that video about Judah and Tamar and things that you see pop up in like the Genesis narrative and what we'll get to here in a minute of how John, the writer of Revelations, uses the Old Testament is there's a lot of intertextuality at play, especially like New to Old Testament or even Old Testament to Old Testament. But there's a lot of like, okay, this has gone on before in the scriptures, or this story reflects this story, right? You have Jesus does this all the time.
Well,
paralleling himself to Moses.
What the biblical authors, a lot of what the biblical authors and characters do is they basically, it's a way of ancient world hyperlinking the story that you're reading to another story within the biblical corpus, right? So this idea of intertextuality, what it does is, I mean, when Jesus says, I'm trying to think of a good example. Or when the Gospel of Mark opens with quotations from the Old Testament, right? The gospel writer isn't just thinking, okay, I want them to read this section. The gospel writer is thinking, where this section comes from says something important about what's happening right now in the story. And so it's wanting you not to just read those words on the page, but wanting you to know what the words on the page here said on the page they originally came from, and the entire section around it. Intertextuality is a wonderful artistic tool and a wonderful tool for building narrative.
Yeah, and I think my point with all those examples, be it very specific ones, are in like the music examples and in the film examples, is this happens all the time, not even just in the same movie, but in the same genres. Or in the expectations of genres, right? The one that we've been talking about is a pretty new one, so I guess spoiler, but again, it's like made over $1 billion, so I'm not really worried about spoiling it. Spider-Man No Way Home, right? Like the whole film is intertextuality. Like,
oh, absolutely.
This is literally what it is all about. So you
don't get 50% of the jokes if you haven't watched like 5 other movies at least. Yeah. And even you could definitely make the whole argument, and this would be a very easy argument to make, that all of what the MCU has done over the past 15 years is a huge practice in, well, elongated storytelling, one, but like intertextuality even inside of that. Because, well, if you didn't see Age of Ultron, then like you don't understand Civil War, because what are the Sokovia Accords? Right? And why do they matter? And why are
Cap agreeing? Exactly. Like, what is this whole conflict? Well, you don't get it because you didn't watch the movie before this. So like, or not even the movie before this, the one that like feeds into this narrative. And like, this is why I get mad when people are like, oh, people nowadays are dumb. I'm like, have you heard people talk about like the MCU movies? Do you like get how in they are on like how complex some of this storytelling is going on? Even though this is like maybe to make the point that Scorsese has been making, like this is a theme park, it's not necessarily cinema. I don't know if you're familiar with that debate at all. It's been happening on like film YouTube for a couple years now. But anyway, like but the point is, even in like what could be considered popcorn movies, and they very much are, they fall in the superhero genre, they fall in the like comic book movie genre. But they're doing things like this and using what came before it to build this movie. Anyone who watches a TV series knows this, right?
Well, and what I think is super interesting, and you can use this as an example to make another point about the Bible, is that at this point, if I was to recommend I have several friends in the area who haven't really watched much of the MCU at all, right? And so I can't just say, hey, go watch the show Loki. It's really good, right? Because they have no idea what's going on. And so many times we have that expectation with the Bible, right? Is we just hand someone the Bible and say, okay, like, I mean, obviously you have to start somewhere as a new Christian, right? But we don't help them understand that there's a complex narrative being woven around even the Gospels. And so we expect them to just be able to pick it up and get it. And we don't really do a good job of educating them about we don't do a good job of educating ourselves sometimes about the way in which the whole biblical canon informs itself in a crossplay, just like the MCU does.
And even wider than that, we'll get back. This will bring us back to the Spider-Man analogy, or like example. So you have like Tom Holland Spider-Man that happened for 2 movies prior to No Way Home, and the like Spider-Man trilogy that they made within the MCU. So even here you have intertextuality of like MCU at large, Spider-Man, specifically like Tom Holland's incarnation, I'll use that word, of Spider-Man, right? That's different than the other Spider-Mans. But anyway, still, dude, because I rewatched the other 2 recently because I'm trying to get my roommate. We're going to go see No Way Home again this weekend.
Nice.
This is how deep the end credit. Sorry, I'm going to like nerd out on these movies for a minute.
That's fine.
The end credit scene in the first one, Homecoming.
Yeah.
Which is, just think about that title for a second.
Yeah. Well, that's some pretty artistic and clever. Anyway, sorry.
So yeah, because they go to home.
Yeah.
Anyway, God, even that title is intertextual, right?
Yeah.
As all good titles should be. But you have the end credit scene, spoiler for a movie that's been out for like 5 years, of Michael Keaton's
Vulture. Adrian
Vulture.
Toomes.
Yeah, I almost said Falcon. I was like, no, that's not right. Yeah, of him meeting Scorpion from where? Andrew Garfield's universe, right?
Yeah.
So
I think, I don't really remember. It's been a minute, so.
Yeah, but so like you have that end credit scene that like connects the two already. So you have Marvel at large, you have Tom Holland Spider-Man, but even in the first Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, you have like subtweets, let's say, to other Spider-Man properties that have existed years before this. And there's a big like bureaucratic thing going on here because it's like Sony and Marvel who owns Spider-Man and who can do what, but that's a different conversation. So you have that going on. And then not only do you have that, but in No Way Home, you have the coalescence of all this. So you have MCU at large, this whole storyline that's going on, Tom Holland's, what would be 3 movies in Spider-Man within the MCU. And then you have the introduction of all the other Spider-Mans, like intertextually linked to this Spider-Man now in this universe, because there's now like a multiverse, right? And then, but not only do you have that, you have all the references, as we've talked about in the movie. You know what, Peter, I'm somewhat of a scientist myself, to like jokes in this movie that you don't get if you haven't seen Spider-Man 1 that came out in 2001. Right? Or 2. I think it was 1
or 2, something like that.
And then you have all the conversations that the different Spider-Mans have about their powers. And like, I can joke about like some of the things I didn't think landed, but like there's that like this is how deep it goes. Like there's that joke, they're on the Statue of Liberty, and the new Statue of Liberty with the Captain America shield, which that's a whole another reference there, where Maguire and Garfield are talking, and Garfield basically goes, yeah, but I'm like born, I'm a bad Spider-Man or something like that. And then Maguire goes, no, you're the amazing Spider-Man. And it's just like, oh my gosh. Literally just a reference to like his line of Spider-Man being the amazing Spider-Man, which is his comic line, but it's also a movie like series. So point is, you have the iceberg essentially of like Marvel, MCU, Tom Holland Spider-Man, his Spider-Man trilogy that interlinks to like the other Spider-Man films, but those other Spider-Man films also link to like the comic book movies. And even if you watch like the Spider-Man series animated from the 90s, there's a whole Mysterio storyline that is literally Far From Home.
The whole, and so what's super interesting is the way in which all of that ties together, and like it takes someone who's really, really knowledgeable about that topic in order to make all of those connections. And me being like a super big nerd who's loved Spider-Man since I was 6, sitting in the theaters watching this, I'm having the time of my life. And some of the jokes don't land, whatever. There are some critiques of the movie.
We can debate the movie another time, but we're using that example.
But ultimately, like it's something that, because I've been engrossed in this, it's amazing. And what then happened, like, and just to take it back to the subject that we start with, like it's the same thing with the Bible, right? And one of the reasons I think we misinterpret the book of Revelation, for example, so often in our culture, and I know you're going to get into this in a little while, is we don't know the Bible well enough to recognize when John's not saying something literally, he's saying something literarily.
Right?
And that's a problem.
we'll come back to that here in just a second, but I want to have a really brief conversation about like language intertextuality and that quote you had about capturing the meaning subjectively expressed in words with multiple possible meanings and translations. Because language, like us as humans who speak languages, are always stuck at a certain point in time. So I'll give you a like relevant, slightly controversial example. So my buddy who just got a puppy not that long ago, we were hanging out and he was talking about him having to go to the vet and get vaccines for her because dogs have to get vaccinated. Now, in 2022, when you hear me say that word vaccine and vaccinated, what pops into your head?
A very intense political debate that has very broad implications for our society as a whole.
Right. But you're not thinking about a dog getting a parvo vaccine, which is what he was talking about. Right. So I even, in that moment, I had to be like, oh my gosh, this word has, I literally thought this, I was like, that word has such different meaning right now. Like even in my own head about like the conversation we were having, and I knew what we were talking about. But in my head, I'm like, dude, you say that word vaccine and all these things, like the word tree just pops up. Right. And this is why context, and this is where I have trouble with certain interpretive frames now that are very postmodern, is like context is the key to understanding like all the ways in which words are being used. And there's a different conversation about like what words are in bounds or not in bounds, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is that like inherently, because we as humans are stuck in time trying to communicate to each other, our words are also stuck in time. So like words have certain meaning now, like vaccine or vaccinated, that had completely different meanings 5 years ago or 3 years ago. Right? Daniel, spell the word rain for me.
Rain, like weather, rain?
Spell the word rain.
R-A-I-N.
Nope. I wasn't thinking about the weather. I was thinking about a king raining. Right? But that's the point. It's like I have certain, now you didn't see it written, so you couldn't assume the authorial intent, but like that's how
and even
you had even in like synonyms that happen in the English language. And this is what's like beautiful about precise speech, right? Rule 7 or rule 10. Be precise in your speech. This is why that's so important, is because with the more precise speech is, and the more you understand what's going on with communication, which is why both speaker and audience are important, right? This is why it is important to like watch how you say things and how they get taken. Right? Is because if you can be precise enough, all of the possibilities of what's being said like slowly diminish.
You narrow your focus down to just a few. I mean, you'll probably never be able to get just one option.
No.
But you can get just to a few options. You're hitting pretty well, and that's better than most people hit.
An example I heard, and we'll get to Revelation here after this example, but just to give a like kind of quaint, trivial example of this and how this is called relevance theory in language. There's a Heiser interview that he does on his podcast. Not the one I'm going to reference just now, but the one that like comes in part of this, he does like interlace with this series on Revelation he's doing, where he talks to another professor about a book he wrote about how relevance theory impacts how we read the Bible. And the professor gives this example, and they were at the school and they were doing chapel, and he walks out of chapel with another professor friend of his, and it's around like noon, lunchtime, and he holds up an apple to this other professor and he says, I guess I'm going to go keep the doctor away. Well, there's a lot that is assumed. And I'm not a pure structuralist when it comes to language, mind you, but I think there's decent arguments to be made for it. But there's a lot of assumptions he's making in that form of communication, right?
Oh, absolutely.
He assumes that you understand the other half of the idiom An app, and him holding up the apple is part of that assumption, right? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, it's like lunchtime, so he's going to go eat. He's not going to like throw it against a tree and watch it, break into a million pieces.
Yeah.
We don't have idioms about throwing apples against trees. Well, maybe someone somewhere does, but not in America.
Well, he's not going to throw it at a doctor to keep the doctor away either, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I mean, there's so many different ways you could take that one, even the one phrase, without the greater cultural understanding.
Yep. And so, but that's also what's keen about like this instance of communication is through everything he says and has literally in his hand, he is narrowing the spectrum of like what he is talking about.
Yeah.
So all that is to say, the Bible is doing very complicated things with its communication. And so and the big point of that podcast episode is like why plain reading hermeneutic is essentially like untenable. Because here's what we do with people who do plain readings of things and communication. We've talked about this.
Yeah.
It's played off as comedy.
Yeah.
There's a reason that Drax, and I think it's hilarious, is like, there's a reason Drax is funny in Guardians of the Galaxy, to make another Marvel reference.
Yeah.
Because he does not understand metaphor and simile and like analogy and language. Literally everything.
Well, at some point, I plan on actually using that as an example in a paper, is because like I'm going to make the point that we are all Drax the Destroyer when it comes to biblical interpretation. Sometimes we say, I think Peter Quill says to Drax, it went over your head. And he said, nothing goes over my head. I would catch it first. My reflexes are too fast. And in making that statement, it's going over his head, right?
Yeah.
That's the funny part of that scene. And so, you're right. We all are Drax the Destroyer at some point because we misunderstand what the Bible is saying, and then we claim, no, I totally get it.
Yeah. So like getting to the bottom of the iceberg is sometimes very difficult, but as we made reference with Spider-Man, a very like relevant thing at our cultural moment, understanding all the layers of what's going on is essential to literally grasping what's happening so it doesn't fly over your head.
We can't, like, the end goal, if we don't like the way the tool's working to get us to our end goal, sometimes we just throw the tool away, right? And I think if it's a good tool, it deserves to be treated well with respect.
Yeah.
Even if it takes us longer to get where we're going.
And I'm not making this argument to say that the historical critical method is flawless, or it is the end all be all of interpretation. That's part of the critique we're laying out here, is that sometimes it's not. Sometimes the Bible is doing much more literary and artistic work than it is doing anything that someone who is uber obsessed with synchronizing the Gospels or like figuring out which one was written when is concerned about in doing historical critical interpretation or hermeneutics. But I think the point we're making is that even within an artistic interpretation, and I think to properly understand art, even with our Spider-Man example, Spider-Man No Way Home doesn't exist if Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man never got made in 2001. It is contingent upon that fact. So it is an artistic expression that happens at a specific time in a specific place because of what had happened before. And it's doing all these things with like the literature of the movie and the like aspects of filmmaking and the intertextual jokes. But it's still contingent upon you understanding what happened before, placing the art in a specific time. And I think that's more what I think we're concerned about is,
Yeah.
okay, if the Bible's going to do a lot of literary, artistic things, then like, and this is essential in, I think, understanding Genesis, understanding the other artistic literary things that go on, like the examples we've given within this certain genre of biblical art. Within
Think back to our first conversation we had the day we technically met and recorded our first podcast. Like, that was all talking about the greater context in which Genesis was brought forth, and how Genesis is a critique of that greater context.
Right. And then if you like, okay, we've picked on some like more like progressive liberal theology, but like to pick on the conservatives.
Yeah.
Then to say like, oh no, but interpretation of Genesis is 7-day creation, literalism, like Ken Ham, is also absurd.
Well, and I mean, Augustine isn't interpreting Genesis 1 that way.
No, even though he would say literal.
And that's his literal interpretation.
Of language.
Right? That's his literal interpretation. But we, 1,500 years later, in the American context, being challenged by the polemic of evolutionary theory has created such a rigid structure around that one concept that it's funny. I was listening to N.T. Wright earlier today on a podcast, and he was talking about how that polemic doesn't exist as strongly within the Christian imagination outside of America. And it's just because in our context, that has become so crucial and well-grounded. And so, yeah, we've picked on the left-leaning theologians, but I was actually expecting more of the critique of this conversation to be because we lean too far that way. And I think we've maybe...
No, and I think that's true. And in a lot of evangelical circles, that is the case.
Yeah.
I just brought up what I brought up because it's been on my mind because of what we read for my class 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So, and it seems to be the way scholarship, at least now, is trending. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
But okay, so sorry that you might not even, listener might not even know the whole rabbit trail that just happened. I might just cut right to the revelation here to keep things rolling. But I wanted to talk about how, so we've made the case for it is super important to interpret the Bible artistically and literarily, and that the plain reading isn't always a plain reading, A, and B is usually unhelpful because you turn into Drax the Destroyer and things not going over your head because you're going to catch them. But I wanted to give, rather than just say that and like have you accept it as the listener, because I'm so smart, I'm in school, we know what we're talking about. I wanted to play a couple excerpts from actually 2 episodes of Michael Heiser's podcast, The Naked Bible, as he intros and then talks about his series in Revelation, and then does some hermeneutical work about how intertextual John is in writing the Revelation, and how he is very sneaky, let's say. You have to have a very keen eye. We'll talk about having keen eyes later in this podcast, hopefully. But you have to really be paying attention. And this goes to the point that has been being made about art happens in a particular place at a particular time. And so to deny that place and time is to rip some of the meaning away from the art. Because as we all know, there are things that sway culture and us as people and as countries and as cultures, as nationalities, as races, like at specific times and specific histories. So like the art that comes out of that is going to reflect that specific time, right? Great example of this would be like blues music or like rock and roll, hip hop even. So yeah, and you can think about why I used all those examples. Anyway, there's more that can be used, but those have particularly been on my mind recently too. So we're going to talk about how John uses the specific things of his day and how he uses the Old Testament to be intertextual in the Bible. So I got a screen there. Thank God I can edit. We don't do this live. Here, I got to share my audio as well. Oh no, that's not what I want. See, I haven't done this in so long that here we go.
Like you said, thank God you can edit.
All right, here we are. Daniel, let me know if you can hear this. I have
Okay.
rough stamps for time here on these 2 episodes. So this first one is from the intro. As you can tell from the title, it's introducing the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. This is Heiser's hermeneutic throughout the whole series, is literally is an intertextual conversation of how does John use the Old Testament. But I think this portion here, Heiser talks about how John specifically is using the Old Testament in a different manner than, say, the writer of Hebrews, Paul, or the gospel writers do in his book specifically.
Things like the Damascus Rule, the Habakkuk Pesher, okay, the Florilegium, it's 4QFLOR. This is a wisdom text from Qumran. These things are easy to compare. The Gospels and Paul's major epistles are easy to compare to this kind of Dead Sea Scroll stuff because they all contain explicit Old Testament quotations. So when Paul quotes an Old Testament passage, he's saying, sometimes some of these other texts also explicitly quote the same passage. And then you can kind of see what the 2 writers, some Qumran document versus Paul, how they're interpreting some section of the Old Testament. You can track their writing, what they're thinking, to the same source. In other words, it's easy because they're both explicitly quoting the Old Testament at a given point. But Moïse continues, the book of Revelation, however, never uses introductory formula to introduce its Old Testament references. It's never going to use stuff like, as it is written, to telegraph what John's going to do. He doesn't do that. So he never uses introductory formula to introduce its Old Testament references, but weaves its words, the words of the Old Testament and phrases, into its own composition. So what it comes down to is there are few, if any, and some would say no, explicit quotations of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Instead, what you get is John drawing words and phrases from different parts of the Old Testament or the same section of the Old Testament and using that to create his own content. And since he's only using bits, even when the bits cluster, it's harder to know exactly where he's drawing things from because that phrase he uses might show up in 10 different Old Testament passages, or maybe only 1, or maybe 3. So which one was John really thinking of? Again, it's hard to figure out what he's doing, and this discouraged scholars from spending a lot of time, in this line of inquiry. Moïse continues.
I'll stop it there. Before I go on, because I'm going to go on to a short section in the next episode where Heiser begins to deal with some of these specific quotations.
Yeah.
I think the first one is really, really interesting because he talks about John's title for God used in Revelation 1:4, how it's a quotation of Exodus 3:14, which we can read those here in a second, but about how John is subverting not only what's expected in the quotation of Revelation 3:14, he is using it as a polemic against what was used as titles for Zeus in Greek literature.
Wow.
So before I play that though, any thoughts on what was just said about John's use of the Old Testament?
I think he's 100% correct in John's use of the Old Testament. And I would say that I do have a critique, though, as he said that, or he maybe didn't say, but implied that the gospel writers don't also use the Old Testament as subtly, saying that, they have the block quotations of like, as it is written, and then, you follow, the quotation follows from that.
Mm-hmm.
I think both the gospel writers and Paul, all of them actually do the same thing Revelation does in including key phrases that, when recognized, I was going to try to find a quote, but I'll just generally paraphrase. But in this book, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, and then there's another book, In the Letters of Paul, by Richard Hayes. He talks about how in the Gospels book, how the Gospels, and in the Letters of Paul, how Paul does this, how there are several different ways in which these intertextual references happen. He says one is a direct quote, one is, I can't remember the term he used. One is a direct quote, one is more or less a paraphrase, or almost word for word, close enough. And then he says the most subtle he calls an echo, which is where he gets the title from. And John in Revelation is basically all echoes.
Mm-hmm.
But how these things do actually exist in all of the other books in the New Testament.
Yeah, and I think you're right in that critique. I think the larger point is that that's what makes Revelation so difficult.
Yes.
Is that you don't
Yes.
have it like Hebrews, where you
Yeah.
have block quotes of the
Yeah.
Old Testament.
Yeah.
Of what
It's
the writer of
entirely.
Hebrews is trying to subvert or expound upon, even in their writing about this being this way back then, but it was just shadows of what was to come.
Yeah.
Right? You get and I don't know if we have time to go there, but you get a like sly inversion of it's Hebrews 2, but it's a quotation of Psalm is the creation psalm.
Well, I feel like
I want to say 25 or 18.
Yeah.
I don't remember. We had a whole Sunday at my church where we discussed how the inversion happens in Hebrews and why that's important, of the psalm of creation, talking about how, and this is but it is also a quotation, right, about who's man that you're mindful of him.
Yeah.
Those statements, but it becomes a creation psalm about Jesus.
Yeah.
In Hebrews, and putting things under his dominion, and not just the dominion of man.
Yeah.
At large, which is what's happening in the Psalms. So again, these things are sneaky. These things are subversive. These things are complicated.
Or subtle.
They're very subtle. To go back to our conversation about why Christians suck at doing art.
Didn't you cut that out?
No, I kept it. It's actually its own snip.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I cut out us watching Good Will Hunting, which maybe, I don't know. Do I regret that now? Maybe not. Anyway, let's move on to I'm making this case that what we're arguing happens in No Way Home is very relevant to how the Bible operates and is intertextual, and it's difficult to understand. So let's move on to a specific example Heiser talks about in Revelation 1:4. I don't know exactly how much of this is going to get played, probably no more than 3 or 4 minutes, because he likes to rabbit trail like we do. So we'll just see where it goes. And I'll play enough that he can make his case and we can understand where he's going. Let me skip ahead here. Got 15 minutes, that's good enough. Again, they're talking about, so you can see it on the screen here, Revelation 1:4, where we find the phrase, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. The phrase is repeated in Revelation 1:8, and it's a direct quotation of the Septuagint, but it's bad Greek. But the argument that Heiser makes, along with other scholars, is that bad Greek is on purpose, because John's evidently not bad at all Greek. So he's causing a direct correlation there because he doesn't phrase it exactly right. It's like when we quote Shakespeare. Well, that's not how we talk.
Yeah.
Some of that language is off. It's not exactly how we structure sentences now in modern English. Again, back to the like language is happening at a particular time, particular place.
Mm-hmm.
And like someone earlier made a joke of like, I bite my thumb at you. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. Right. But like, this is a Shakespeare thing. And it's like, again, this is all complicated. It's messy.
Yeah.
So, but here, so this is what they're referencing is these quotations in Revelation 1:4, why John uses this explicit quotation. So we'll let him explain.
Is considered by scholars to be contemporaneous with the book of Revelation.
Hang on, go back just a bit.
It seems, coherent, but none of this is an exact parallel to the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14 or John 1:4. But you get similar language about these other gods, the Greek gods. There's actually a closer parallel, though. A Greek writer, Pausanias, citing an oracle at Dodona, is the one that's.
They're talking about that phrase, who is, who was, and who is to come, specifically right now.
Really close. And this text is considered by scholars to be contemporaneous with the book of Revelation. So, first century, when John's writing, or maybe a little bit before. And it describes Zeus. And here's the description. Zeus is described as Zeus was, Zeus is, Zeus shall be. O mighty Zeus. Zeus, of course, was considered at the time in the pagan world to be the Most High. The term houpsistos in Greek, which means Most High, is used of Zeus a lot. So the pagan world is thinking Zeus is the Most High deity. And he was, and he is, and he shall be. So as soon as you run into that, you're thinking, okay, it seems like John is taking a shot at the Greco-Roman Most High God, Zeus. I'm going to read a little something from DDD, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, about the term houpsistos. It says, this is a superlative form from the adverb houpsi, again, which means high or highest or most high. You have the article up front, so it serves as a noun. So houpsistos, ha houpsistos, the most high. And it has the sense of most high or highest. In the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, again, that would be the Septuagint, elyon, the Hebrew word elyon, is always translated by ha houpsistos, the most high. In these instances, as in the Greek literature of Judaism in the Second Temple period and in the literature of primitive Christianity, the expression ha houpsistos refers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In non-Jewish or non-Christian texts written in Greek, the expression occurs as a divine name for Zeus. Okay, so it's the end of the quote. Did the Septuagint translator? It's a good question. Did the Jew, who in the Hellenistic period, the guys who did the work translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, did the guy who got Exodus, did he render the divine name in Exodus 3:14 the way he did to challenge the status of Zeus? I mean, because he who is, ego eimi, I myself am the one who is. Okay, is that a shot? Because what John does is John takes that and then he adds it. I mean, John makes it completely transparent because he adds the other two elements that he is. I mean, it's pretty evident if you were a Greek person, if you were a Gentile especially, but if you knew Greek well, you're familiar with this title. And John is not talking about Zeus here. He's talking about the God of Israel. He gives him this titling of Zeus, which ties in back to Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. So it seems that this is what John's doing. He's sort of laying down the gauntlet. And McDonough picks up on this point and he says,
all right, I'm going to stop it there. I see you keep nodding your head, so I have one more snippet from this episode I'm going to play, but
yeah,
any comments on that? And if I started it too soon, and I will link these two episodes in the description if you want to listen to the full thing. I highly recommend them. But if you didn't catch, Heiser's basic point is he's doing a polemic to Zeus as well as making a direct quotation of Exodus 3:14. in reference to God. And in the narrative he's telling, it's clear that the reference is to God in Revelation 1:4.
Yeah. So that's crazy. This morning, actually, in preparation for my Romans class, I read a commentary, and in this specific section of the commentary, it was talking about how Jews related to Roman society.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently there was a rather prominent Roman official who we have his writings, and he refers to the Jews as those who worship Zeus by another name. And I thought that was really interesting. And now it just really clicked in my head. One of the reasons why I thought that was interesting was because it made me ask the question, why Zeus? Why not one of the other gods of the pantheon? And, naturally I was kind of like, well, Zeus is like their top guy, right? But now this makes so much more sense, right? Because the parallel to Zeus isn't just in the rank of the gods, right? It's not Yahweh versus Zeus because Yahweh is the highest and Zeus is the highest, but it's also linguistic in the Septuagint. It's embedded in it. That's crazy.
But it's complicated, man. There's layers. There's layers.
Fantastic. That is fantastic.
All right, I'll play maybe another minute and a half of this next. I have this next timestamp. I didn't make reference to exactly what timestamp, so it's
Gotcha.
Might be a surprise.
But this is how Zeus is described. And McDonough continues. As they sang at Dodona, Zeus was, Zeus is, and Zeus will be. The name Yahweh, we will see, was ready to enter the etymological fray as the one who is. But this in turn led back to the questions posed by Greek philosophers about the nature of being and its relationship to time and space. Yahweh's confrontation with the gods of the nations was about to take a new turn. So, again, this is McDonough and other commentators are thinking what John's doing here is, in fact, not just, hey, remember hey, you readers who might have some acquaintance with Judaism. I'm using this phrase now and I'm committing a grammatical error so that you go look and find Exodus 3:14. Oh, well, okay, the same God of Exodus 3:14, the same God of the burning bush is the God that John's writing about now. Well, that's all true. John wants people to see that, but he wants more. So he supplements it. It's not only the he who is, but he who was and who was to come. And when he adds those two elements, it's a swipe at Zeus. So now he's looping the pagans in too, and anybody else in the Jewish community who might be familiar with how pagans looked at Zeus and how Zeus was set as a rival or better than Yahweh. So just this one little selection from Exodus 3:14, and then supplementing it a little bit, giving it a little more play, is actually, again, theological telegraphing. It's significant. So just to go on here,
we can stop there. That's enough examples, at least for now. But yeah, John is subtweeting Zeus, even in his so. And what is so important to catch is that it's only that first phrase that John is directly quoting Exodus 3:14, the one who is. And then he adds the other two articles to further his point. So it's literally in the same sentence. He is doing two things at once with two different contexts. I'm trying to think of a good example of the way we mix metaphors is maybe a lesser example of this.
Yeah.
But what's if you can think of any examples of how we it happens in conversation all the time, again, because we're not being literalists. We're trying to explain things as we go, And you'll have a conversation with somebody when you're trying to figure something out, you're trying to think about things, and you say, someone might start the conversation and say, like, this situation or this concept we're talking about is analogous to this thing over here. And then you might say, someone in the conversation later might say, well, to maybe stretch that analogy more, or to like bend that some, it's like this or like that in this way. And then someone might say, oh no, but this is a better way to describe that thing, kind of piggybacking off that analogy. This happens all the time. Like, we say that things are foundational when we're not talking about construction.
Yeah.
Right.
Or, I mean, draw me a bath. That's not, you're not drawing a bath, like, no one thinks that that's what you're doing. Right. So yeah, when we expect the Bible to do something that no one actually does in real life with language, it's completely unrealistic expectation.
Mm-hmm.
It just is, which is why historical, literary, linguistic, and cultural context matter, right? If we didn't have the linguistic context, you wouldn't be able to recognize the hyperlink to Exodus. And if you didn't have the cultural context, you wouldn't be able to recognize the hyperlink to Zeus.
Mm-hmm.
And if we didn't have the historical background on that, we wouldn't be able to understand the significance of that. And because we know that Revelation is an apocalypse, just like the book of Daniel or other apocalypses.
Or even at least portions of the book of Daniel.
Yeah. Then we wouldn't know what to expect of Revelation.
I think that's also part of our difficulty in understanding Revelation. I made this point to other people.
Mm-hmm.
We have no modern, and I might even said this to you, we have no modern proxy for apocalyptic literature.
No.
We know how poetry works. So we can read biblical poetry and understand, like, okay, cool. Like, I get to not literally take everything at face value, right? Yeah. There's hyperbole, there's analogy, there's word images, there's pictures, right? God is not literally a fortress, right? We know how, at least at some level, how, I know the Gospels aren't specifically biographical narratives in the way that we would think of them now. But they are doing like some of that.
Yeah.
Right? So we get that idea. We understand the epistles more so because they're mostly letters of encouragement or of correction.
Yeah.
Right? So we understand how to like theologize advice, let's say. Although maybe we're not as good as that as we would like to think. We understand how history and even myth work. So like Genesis, Exodus, we understand how law, at least at some level, works. So we get Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all this stuff. We understand like historical narratives. So like First, Second Kings, Samuel, prophetic books. We have no modern equivalent to apocalyptic literature. So it is really, and how do we understand, like, and this is why I think Peterson's work, especially in the first 2 lectures of his biblical series, is helpful. What do we do with dreams and visions? How are we to understand them, right? I mean, I'll give you, I just want to give a crazy example. So let's talk about Ezekiel. Thank you. He talks about all these winds and these creatures. I'm trying to find the specific reference. Okay, this is the beginning of chapter 2, after he has all these visions.
Mhm.
His call to be a prophet. He said to me, Son of man, stand up, and he sees the Lord. He says to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. Side note, this is why Jesus' use of Son of Man is debated, because
Yep.
there's many instances, there's different
Yep.
meanings for the phrase within even the biblical canon.
Yep.
Another conversation. As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speak to me. He said, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. Interesting phrase for our modern context. But anyway, the people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, and whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious people, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, Son of man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Okay, there's some metaphorical language there.
Yeah.
Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them. Though they are rebellious people, you must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. But you, Son of man, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like the rebellious people. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yep.
Then I looked, and I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll, which he unrolled before me. Interesting, the personification of God, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
On both sides of it were written words of lament and mourning and woe. And he said to me, this is chapter 3, Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll, and then go and speak to the people of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then he said to me, Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving you, and fill your stomach with it. And this is the most interesting phrase, I think, in the whole section. So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth. What the heck is going on?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of questions here, right? Is he literally eating the scroll?
Yeah.
Does it actually taste like that? Is this metaphorical representation to be taken of what is in the prophet are the words of God?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is this a dream? Is this a vision? Are those different? Is he like he says the Spirit came upon him and he stood up. So how literal is this whole experience?
Well, and beyond that, it's obviously, it means something greater than just the acts that are transpiring. So even if it is literally happening, the question then becomes, what do these actions mean? Right? And then to rope it into our greater point, this exact same sequence happens in Revelation with John, where he's told to eat a scroll and it tastes sweet. And when he starts to digest it, it makes his stomach upset. And so, yeah, I mean, this image in its original context is already really weird, right? And then you have to carry that into what John's doing. And then, so yeah, we don't really have a parallel in our culture to understand the original setting, let alone the reference to it that happens centuries later.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of wrap up this conversation, I guess my question is, we've talked about how this reality of the Bible as art affects us and affects our interpretation and reading of the Bible. And this is why I think what the Bible Project does is absolutely amazing and necessary.
Yeah.
And
I
so pertinent, because they are on, as far as I can tell, with John and Tim, they are on a highly literary reading of the Bible
Mm-hmm.
and doing these kinds of things and threading major themes and words and stuff like that. So just praise for them. But how, I guess my question for us to kind of discuss for a minute is, how should this reality, hopefully we've convinced you that it is a real reality of
Yeah.
the biblical text, in being art and in having to have artful eyes to interpret it or literary eyes to interpret it. How does this affect us in 2022, in the age of the internet, in spaces where literal readings are very relevant to people, right? And what would be like more evangelical conservative circles, and in where even rejections of those kinds of readings or any kind of historically critical reading seems to be prevalent in academia right now.
Yeah.
And in more mainline or like liberal Protestant circles. So or reader response theories, which maybe this is a good place to start. What I find saddening, ironic, and in that sense, like hilarious, is that what we referenced earlier about read response interaction with the Bible is a pretty postmodern approach to literature.
Yeah.
Right. How do you, and I think there's something to be said for it. I'm not just going to shit on this forever. Right. I think there's utility to understanding that I as a, and this is kind of what we're trying to get at. I, as a person in 2021, informed by all my experience, informed by my culture, informed by my language. This is why the work of translation is so difficult. Informed by my experiences, my culture, my place in the world, right? Me, a 25-year-old in North America, is going to read this way differently than a person who grew up in Tokyo their whole life, but is the same age as me.
Yeah.
And interfaces with the Bible. Right.
Yeah.
Like all these things are at play, which is the recognition of a lot of postmodern philosophy and critiques of literature, which are all very real and relevant. Let us not diminish those.
No, not at all.
But in the work of interpreting then what's happening with those, what you could say barriers or lenses, I think maybe is a better word. We have to, maybe if we have time when we're done with this or at another late point, speak about Lewis's definition of what literature and literary are supposed to do. I think that could be a very great conversation.
Yeah.
Anyway, my point is that approach of read response that is very real and relevant and true of I, as a reader, bring certain things to a text that have to be wrestled with.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty liberal progressive generally idea.
Yeah.
But even in the church settings, even most conservative church settings I've been in, what happens when we sit down to do Bible study? Hey, we assigned Mark chapter 1 this week. All right, so what did you guys get from the text this week? What did it mean to you?
Yeah.
Not a bad question, keep in mind.
No.
My point is that they're using a very different approach than what they might think is appropriate.
Yeah.
For any other text than the Bible, because there is something to be said about the universalness of the truths in the Bible and the ways that they speak to us and what they mean for our lives and how the Spirit interacts with our interaction of the text, right? That's all there.
Yeah.
I just make that point because it seems so ironic that in places where, say, a very literalist interpretation of Genesis would occur, of a 7-day creation, of all of that, take a very liberal postmodern approach to Bible study.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I'm not against that at all. In fact, I think maybe I haven't done as good a job at defining the artistic bend, right? Because there's both the objective and the subjective. And the objective is definitely that historical, critical, literary analysis, breakdown of the language, and all of that. But the subjective is what we bring to the table in that artistic and intuitive and imaginative sense. And we have to use the framework of objectivity that we can verify, which isn't always easy to verify that it is objective in the first place. And that's a whole nother conversation and something that I plan to explore later. But we have to use that framework, I think, in order to guide a more reader response approach, right? Because it's within that framework that then that reader response approach can grow and flourish. Because anything that grows outside of the bounds can get trimmed off and it can be pruned to the point where it grows something beautiful.
Yeah.
And that was the artistic approach summed up.
That was great. That's kind of where I was trying to go with the question is,
yeah,
what is our response to this way of interpretation? Because even in what would be considered very conservative circles, a very liberal approach to interfacing with the Bible is taken every week in Bible studies.
Yeah.
So,
well, and one other thing that this whole writing this paper that I did and thinking about it in preparation for today has really given me is, and there's an Augustine quote that I put in the paper. I'll read it real quick. What is difficult for me if I understand the text in a way different from someone else who understands the scriptural author in another sense? What he's saying here is, as long as we're both within some kind of generally Christian bounds, if you come away from the text with something different than I do, and we can't verify which one of us is objectively correct, we can still live in community. We should have enough intellectual humility to be okay with each other and to love each other and to grow, right? And so to go beyond just this interpretive method, implicit in it is a sense of humility in myself that the objective sometimes, and even this, and especially the subjective interpretations that I bring to the table might not be correct, and you might be correct. And I need to love and respect you, even when we come into conflict.
Yeah, and I think what we're fighting for or proposing more so in this episode is kind of what it means to play the game in bounds, right? Yeah. Because I take any sport, I'll use basketball just because I know it the best. The game would be utter chaos if there was no boundary lines for the court.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, and like we said earlier, any interpretation you have has its own boundary lines, whether you recognize them or not.
Yeah.
The struggle that we have here is, okay, how do we take the approaches that have been given through history and how we know the Bible works in and of itself to then understand what's going on here, right? And so, but even within the bounds of the court for basketball, you have different positions. You have 10 players, 5 on one side, 5 on the other. You have a 3-point line for a reason, because you might want to shoot threes if you're Steph Curry. But if you're Shaq, I don't want you shooting threes, right? Yeah. I don't want you shooting free throws. But there's multiple ways to score.
Yeah.
And you can do it. You could be, to your mixed analogies, you can be the Kansas City Chiefs and you can do some crazy stuff on the field. But the goal is still the same. The goal is to get the touchdown. The goal is to score the basket. The goal is to get the swoosh. The goal is the buzzer beater, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we, in the pursuit of understanding God and grasping truth and knowing what it means to follow Jesus, know the proper bounds for interpreting what has been handed to us as scripture? And I think all the layers which we've talked about, how all this operates and how communication itself operates, are important in understanding what it means to score.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to, I guess, bring us at least a little bit closer to a close, one thing that kept coming to mind as I was thinking about this and preparing for this talk is Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. He talks about, now we see through a glass darkly. And then we shall see face to face. Then we shall see more clearly, right? And I think about another artistic expression is impressionistic painting. You have the realist paintings and you have the impressionistic. And I think right now we see impressionistically, and what Paul is seeing is later we will see more realistically. But while we live in this impressionistic space, seeing the blurred lines and the muddled colors, we have three things, right? Faith, hope, and love is what he follows that up with. And as we start to see more clearly, the faith is no longer really as necessary because we're seeing clearly. The hope is no longer really necessary because the thing we're hoping for becomes reality. But the love still is the thing that remains. It persists throughout because we are supposed to love now in the intellectual humility and the difference that we have. And we are still to love then at the culmination when we see perfectly clear. And so I guess if there's one thing that this artistic interpretive lens, I hope, brings, is that humility to love now as it points to the love that we're supposed to have, even in the culmination of all things.
All right, well, that's the best place, if any, I think, to end it. So I will stop recording.
Sounds good.
Yo, King Commies, look out, tell them, look out for my worldview. Cloudy when you sinking, got you thinking it's a whirlpool. Caesar in your pockets, you can't see who's in your pockets, but Stevie's inner visions touch your eyes and make the world move. Wifey bob her head and make her curls move. Crown jewel is character, and this ain't immortality with fairy dust. Never land, never say I never gave you hands. If I can't give them back, then you look like